Wow, it's not too early here, but I wanted to say good morning from where I'm at. Normally I take off on weekends and kind of do some other things, but I wanted to keep kind of thinking about this settlement problem. Here's here's kind of what I'm theorizing, and I'm really trying to wrap my head around this whole thing because I think that is once I do that, I think I might be able to help with it. But it's still going to be a shot in the dark, I think. Okay, so let's talk about the game engine and settlements without any scripts. Well, the scripts may apply because I'm not sure when the actual calculations are done. But let me just try and wrap my head around this. Okay, so problems seem to be occurring in settlements. This is where the problem is occurring. Objects not loading, physics, things like that. It seems to be when transitioning into settlements. I've never noticed this anywhere in the wasteland except in a settlement where collision is not loading and simply saving and reloading in that settlement seems to fix it. Again, I think that's probably going to be just maybe certain circumstances are happening, or maybe you go to reload the cell, it knows that what is already loaded for that cell it doesn't need anymore, and then what for some reason it didn't load properly, it's now loading. I'm not sure because the objects are there, you can see them. It's just the physics are getting messed up. Okay, so we're in a settlement. So that workshop gets loaded into memory. So more detailed information about that workshop gets loaded into memory. Now, transitioning between the cells shouldn't really make any difference as far as objects go. That should be the same piece of that engine. If there's a building in Sanctuary, then there's a building in Concord, they're still buildings. They still have meshes, collision, all that kind of thing. The only difference is the objects that are added by the workshop. Okay, so to me, the common factor in this happens to be the workshop, things that are connected with the workshop. So, you've got objects not loading that were built and, they're stored in the workshop. Numbers are wonky in the Pip-Boy workshop. So it seems to be associated with that workshop. So I'm thinking we're in a settlement and all of those objects load. Everything should load up. And let's assume at this point it does. We now know how many turrets are there. We know how many of the resources that are normally in that workbench. If you, I don't know, like status, the statistics or whatever I want to call those variables. We know they're there. So we know how much defense, how many food objects are there, how many settlers are there, who's assigned to those food objects. And we're in workshop mode, so we're assigning settlers. We can assign settlers, we can move them around. That's going to shift the numbers. Once we exit workshop mode, those numbers, there should be somewhere in memory where those static numbers are. So there has to be a reference, and I'm not sure what Bethesda does, if they like hashing it out and then using a dictionary to look up that hash to get at those variables. There's something, there has to be somewhere those variables are stored in memory. It's kind of like a cumulative, it's a global, it's got to be a global. It's got to be a global reference. Because once you exit out of the workshop and you leave that settlement cell, once you leave that cell, then you should be able to just simply look at your Pip-Boy. And again, this is not about the Pip-Boy. I'm just talking about trying to wrap my head around it. You should look at the Pip-Boy, and the Pip-Boy should look at those global numbers, those static numbers. And this has nothing to do with workshop persistent, none of that stuff. So I'm talking about just the game engine. You should be able to look at those static numbers. You know, and of course, while you were in the settlement, anything you do changes those static numbers. Changes those numbers. But they have to be static or global, or something that is stored in a dictionary or an array somewhere. But it has to be static. It has to remain in memory. And the reason being is, if I leave that settlement, I leave that cell, those objects unload, or some of them unload, that are no longer being used, or if memory, you know, if memory is required, where it's going to unload things that it doesn't think it needs anymore. And let's say that I'm over in, I don't know, Lexington, and I have a beacon turned on in Sanctuary. My throat's getting dry. Have a beacon turned on in Sanctuary. Then a settler shows up. It literally says, okay, there's certain things that are done during certain hours of the game. You know, like a certain time frame. So after so many hours, can I add a settler to the game? I can. However, I, the player, am not in Sanctuary. I'm way over in Lexington. But I know I can look up and say, I want to update Sanctuary. So I need to load. There has to be a script, or I don't know if it's in a script or a game engine. This I'm not familiar with. But whatever it is, it has to say it's Sanctuary's time. I'm going to make a loop through all of these settlements. So I need to bring up these static numbers. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to load those static numbers up. And if those numbers are global variables, then I can only do this one at a time. Because if I have two running at the same time, that, you know, where one grabs something from, let's say, a dictionary, and then has static, or then has global variables, because it's not instanced or it's not reentrant. Then if another script decides to grab those variables or get those variables, it decides to get it at the same time, those global variables are getting changed interim. So that means the numbers are going to get scrambled. So let's just say that doesn't happen. So the static variables should be the thing that Papyrus is looking at, unless those global variables are kept in Papyrus itself. So, in other words, Papyrus is used to interface with the game engine. You know, as an example, when I go into workshop mode, that's the game engine. And then once I'm done, it has to trigger Papyrus to then update, or, you know, or look at whatever numbers that I've just changed. If that's how that works. But I'm in Lexington, so I know it's time to add a settler to Sanctuary. So I've grabbed the Sanctuary data. I've pulled it out of wherever it is, because it has to be persistent in memory. It's got to be static somewhere. It's got to be global. I know it's a settler, and now outside of Workshop Framework automatically assigning beds and automatically assigning anything, I know there's a settler there. So the settler count is going to go up. And I've seen that happen before, where all of a sudden now there's more settlers, and it will flag as saying, now I'm not going to the settlement, it will flag as saying you've got more settlers in, you need more food or whatever. You know, of course, I do have Workshop Framework in there, which is set to auto-assign. And that's fine. But I know, you know, if I'm assigned to a defense object, so I know what defense objects are there. So that has to be stored somewhere, because I am away from that cell. So if I'm going to assign a settler, okay, let's say we don't assign them to anything. I have a settler, and I know how, I'm looking at the static variables. I know how much food is there. I know how much defense is there. So I can do certain things with that. I can calculate attacks, whether I want to attack the settlement. I can do certain things with it without ever having to. I just simply load up that those static or global references. However, when I need to assign somebody to an object, I'm now going to have to load up those objects, because how do I even know how many objects are there? Like, and what I mean by object is, let's say, guard posts, um, unassigned food items. How do I even know they're there? So those objects have to be stored. If you know, if I'm talking about the game engine, they have to, if they have to be stored. But if you notice in the vanilla game, we can't do that. You can't assign somebody something unless they're directly assigned. You can't do it. You have to be in the settlement to make that assignment, because now you have to be able to keep track of what objects, what assignable objects are in that settlement. Now, I don't know if that is done by the actual game, or if there are scripts that do that. You kind of follow what I'm saying? So the static variables are there. Now, the static variables are there. So somewhere along the line, the variables are getting confused. There's something confusing it. Now, in this test that I just did, I wanted to get as many workshops as I could, but I didn't. That's why I turned off the beacons. Because, if you ever seen those little kind of a let's play thing I did, or even before that, I wanted to leave the beacons off. So that way, nobody, there were no settlers coming in, whether by the game engine's design or whether by workshop framework. There was no, nothing was coming in. I did not have any zero values for any of those resources. However, I was thinking, my first theory was, the more settlers, the more settlements that need to analyze settlers and adding and removing assignable objects. Maybe that is what's causing the problem, because I didn't notice that until I had 3. That's when it started. That's when I noticed the problem starting up, because normally when I play the game, I will literally, I need to have some kind of animated background, but normally when I play the game, I literally will grab Sanctuary first, build it up. The beacon automatically comes on because it's part of the settlement design. It comes on automatically when it powers up. I use transfer settlements, but that's really incidental right now. That's not what we're talking about. But we're talking about that there's something that builds the settlement up, fires on the beacon, people start coming in. Sometimes they will be there before I even get the Concord 5 there. Go to Red Rocket, do the same thing. Then instead of hitting Abernathy next, I will go to Starlight Drive-In, because that's simply clearing mole rats, and I'll build. I'll use TS to build the city, the plan, the settlement, build the settlement. That automatically fires on the beacon when it powers up, and then I go to, this is how I normally play every single one when I test it, and then I go over to Sunshine Tidings and do the same thing. Those are some that don't require any quests. I just eliminate what's there, get on the workbench, I'll go into workshop mode, exit out so that I own the workshop, and then just simply build a settlement. But they do have people there. And I noticed that the more settlements I have that have settlers, the more then problems start occurring. Because if you look over here at this all these times I played the game, outstanding this random crash, which I couldn't replicate. Outside of that, and this could be where there is a DLL that is, when DLLs hook into the game, they could be injecting objects into game lists, and then somehow that object is not ready to be injected or not able to be processed at that moment for whatever reason, and then it's crashing. And that could be part of that initialization of the object. So maybe injecting is bypassing some kind of initialization of the object, and that's why it's getting a null reference, because I couldn't replicate it. But when you look at this, and I should have put little comments in here, I didn't think about that, to actually show when problems start occurring. But I never had a zero value reference, and I checked. I would constantly look at the numbers. I wouldn't have a zero value for a resource that existed. Let me put it that way. Until I started getting more than one settlement with settlers. So my question kind of would be, because now that I look, so that's how I'm looking at it. Because remember, outside of workshop framework and outside of anything that's trying to do anything with the objects, going into workshop mode is something that you need to do in a settlement. So that is when the cell is loading data. That's when the game engine loads that cell data. And then once you leave that cell data, the only numbers that would change would be whether you have more settlers coming in. And that would be part of those global static variables. There's another settle, and it could even be, like I say, it has to be in an array or a dictionary. It cannot be, because you've got multiple settlements. And then therefore you simply perform a very simple calculation on the game engine performs, or the official script, settlement script, performs a simple calculation by saying, how many settlers do I have? Do I have enough food? Do I have enough water? I can flag those. Now with the power grids are flagged if one of the objects is damaged, or if the power grid, if something in the power grid doesn't have power, that will be flagged. So something that is connected that for some reason doesn't have power, if something needs repaired or damaged, that is when power grids get flagged. Beds, I've never seen beds get flagged unless there are more people than there are beds, and then beds will get flagged. So those static variables, part of the game engine. So there's no calculation on assignment. There's no calculation for defense numbers are already known. Those things are already known. So you understand what I'm saying? So when I go into when the game engine loads that cell, it knows how much is in there. It already knows that. And when I leave that cell and all those objects unload, all I need is the static variable of how many people are in that settlement. Well, no, that's not true. I need to know those static variables, those resource variables. That's all I need to know. I'm not assigning anyone. I just need to know. So if I've got 10 food and now 11 people come in, I can easily compare those numbers. And then I can say, okay, obviously food is going to be flagged. But if there is a script running that is trying to cache these values, trying to cache these settlement objects so it can auto-assign when you're outside of that settlement, then maybe that is the source of the problem. Because with multi-threading, there's no telling what is going to get hit when. In other words, if you have a single function that does that, there's no telling what is going to get hit when. And then therefore, if you have a script that is running that retrieves that data, and then it's in the process of updating that data, and then you have another script running, like let's say whether it's the game engine that's doing its thing or that script, then you're going to have a data conflict, because you've got a single point of data, a single source of data that is now being accessed simultaneously by differing threads. That is what this behavior looks like to me. So, to me, and like I say, I can't easily test this, but a person with Vortex or a person using Model Organizer 2 can very easily do this. To literally try, do it with vanilla, and then start adding in things like Workshop Framework, and then add in things like Workshop Plus to rule those out. And then, because I've seen this before, so I've seen this before Scourge, I've seen this before, I think I had Rob Kilpatrick in a while back, I've seen it before Scourge, I've seen it before True Damage, so those are not causing it. And I don't think there's anything in there that's causing it, unless it's something in how those objects are cached. And I don't understand how it's done, but this is just my guess. Let me see how long we're doing here. I don't want this to be super long. Yeah, we're approaching 20 minutes. Okay, so that's what I'm thinking. See, I'm thinking the game engine doesn't cache the objects, but maybe there is a script that is doing that to auto-assign, such as Workshop Framework. That's just a guess. And if the code, for some reason, because the problem, it's not so much a problem, the way I understand the VM works is any frame can be executed at any time. So if there are global variables, I'm assuming, I'm not a scripting person, but I'm assuming you do have instance or reentrant or local variables in a script. But you still have to have global variables to keep track of those resource numbers outside of the cell. So breaking that logic might cause a problem. Maybe that's what's causing the problem. So that's what I'm theorizing. That's just, that's just my theory as to what the issue is. And then therefore, when you load the game is it's initializing everything from scratch. So it's going back to whatever data it had previously. Now, what's interesting about that is if those static variables are stored in that workshop, if those static variables are stored outside of being in a settlement workshop, they correct themselves. So the numbers are correct. By saving and loading, the numbers are actually correct, but there is something in game that is interfering with those numbers. Because if those numbers were actually wrong, then saving and loading wouldn't make any difference. So whatever is happening when a game is loading is correcting that. Now maybe that's part of that loading process where it goes in and it recalculates everything. So what would be interesting is if there was a recalculation script that could be done, and I'm not a scripting person, but if I was good at scripting, what I would do is I would make something through the MCM where I could literally just have a key press assigned, and that would automatically do whatever recalculation is done that you mentioned was costly, that was mentioned as being costly as far as scripting goes, because therefore it's on demand, and see if that fixes the issue, if it needs to be reloaded where everything needs to be cleared out and then it reloaded again. So in other words, there's no these structures don't exist anymore because all the memory was clear and now it's reloading the variables. I'm not entirely sure. You know what I mean? I don't know what's being kept in memory and what isn't, but I do know that saving and reloading does fix those numbers. So there is something in there that is sitting in between what is initially loaded and what's happening in game that is interfering with those resource numbers. And that interference seems to get worse with more settlements. So the more settlements you have, things start cropping up. Now, the problem that existed before, where numbers were wrong, but they weren't all the bed count, was somebody was saying it was televisions caused the issue. It had something to do with the power grid. Televisions used radiant power in the power grid, and they were saying by scrapping the televisions, that fixed it. But what I'm wondering is if it was truly scrapping the televisions or simply going into workshop mode, which then then at that point the game engine says, okay, I'm going back in. Now I'm going to restore those settlement numbers. So once you did something in the settlement, such as power grid or adding, something, deleting something, adding something, it had to recalculate that. So it wasn't so much the televisions did it, but it was going in to delete the televisions. Because I believe back in OG Fallout 4, when I had those televisions, I scrapped all of those televisions and I still had a problem. A problem still occurred. But like I say, it seems like to me, if I was just to look at it and just make a guess, just an educated guess, I would say it is a reentrant problem with multiple things are trying to access pieces of data at the same time. And I had that same issue here, same issue with this thing here, because I didn't normally, I didn't even start doing multi-threaded stuff until God, what, 2 years ago, like last year, maybe 2 years ago. I heard, when I thought, okay, this is a good idea. Didn't even start that, and I can't even begin to tell you the weirdness that would happen. I mean, it was really weird, unrelated things, and I could take you through each one, but I don't want to waste your time doing that. But it's what the problem is. You would not even guess multi-threading being the issue. You wouldn't even guess that. I mean, somebody might say, yeah, sure, I'll guess it, but then, that's. But anyways, I'm just talking about you wouldn't even guess that because you're thinking, okay, I've got bad data. And then, when it can't be replicated, then to me, that's not data. Well, it is, but it's not, the data is bad. It's somehow accessing the data. It's not getting the correct values because something's interfering with that. That would be a threading issue. Now, I don't understand threading on scripting. I'm not sure about, when people set up threads or save threads. The only thing I know, the only way I know around something like that is to make sure that, I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure if things could be updated only when a person enters a settlement, on cell load. If it's a settlement or it's a workshop, then if it would be possible for them to literally just say, this is when we need to update any any of the variables. I don't know, but just wanted to kind of have an early morning thought, and I do have some things I have to do today, so I'm not going to be able to spend much time with this. So hopefully I'll be able to get to it later on this evening, and I'll be able to do some more testing and try to get a little bit more information, because I do want to go in and get all the workshops or a good chunk of the workshops without having any settlers appear. So that way I can just test Sanctuary, and then I can see where the breaking point is. All right. So, anyways, that's what I was thinking. So, yeah, if you have any thoughts, toss them my way, and I'll see what I can kind of work in.